By the summer of 1942, Germany stood at the height of its power. From the Atlantic to the Caucasus, Nazi banners flew over conquered lands. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, and Hitler believed his armies could bend history to his will. Operation Case Blue, the Grand Southern Offensive, promised to bring the Soviet Union to its knees. The plan was simple: seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and capture the industrial hub on the Volga, Stalingrad. But beneath the triumphal speeches and iron confidence lay fatal flaws. The German army was overstretched, its supply lines fragile, and its command divided by ego. Hitler dismissed logistics as secondary to willpower. He divided his forces in pursuit of symbolic goals, ordering simultaneous drives toward Baku and Stalingrad. His generals hesitated to oppose him. What had once been a lightning war of movement turned into a campaign of exhaustion. As the Sixth Army crossed the Don, its fate was sealed not by the enemy, but by the arrogance of its own command. The illusion of invincibility would soon collapse beneath the rubble of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was never meant to be more than a waypoint, yet it became an obsession. To Hitler, the city's name was personal. To lose it meant humiliation. To take it meant immortality. He demanded it be captured stone by stone. His generals warned that the Soviet resistance was too fierce, the front too wide, and the coming winter too close. Hitler ignored them all. The Luftwaffe bombed the city into ash, believing it would destroy morale. Instead, the ruins became the Soviets' greatest weapon. Every crater, every broken wall turned into a fortress. Tanks could no longer maneuver. Artillery fire vanished into the maze of debris. The Germans advanced yard by yard, fighting for stairwells and factory floors. What Hitler saw as progress was actually entrapment. The Sixth Army was bleeding itself dry for a pile of rubble that no longer had military value. The more he demanded, the more his troops sank into a battle of attrition, one the Soviets were prepared to win. While the Sixth Army fought for every room in Stalingrad, its flanks stretched hundreds of kilometers north and south, guarded not by Germans, but by Romania, Hungary, and Italy. These troops were brave, but poorly armed. Their anti-tank guns were obsolete, their winter gear non-existent. Soviet scouts observed everything they knew where to strike. Paulus and other commanders begged Berlin for reinforcements. Hitler refused. "The Russians are finished," he said. "There will be no attack." The Wehrmacht, once the master of modern warfare, now ignored its own principles of mobility and flexibility. By November 1942, Soviet armies had quietly massed on the frozen steppe. German intelligence underestimated their strength by half. Stalin and his generals saw their moment approaching. While the Sixth Army battled ghosts inside the ruins, the Red Army prepared a blow that would echo across the world. The flanks, forgotten and thin, would become the door through which destruction entered. At dawn on November 19th, 1942, the steppe erupted. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire, shaking the frozen earth. The sky burned red as Operation Uranus began. The counterstroke that would change the war, Romanian and Italian lines shattered within hours. Soviet tanks roared through the gaps, cutting through snow and smoke toward Kalak. On the Don, German officers watched in disbelief as radio messages turned to static. Supply columns vanished. Rear depots fell silent. Within 4 days, the jaws closed. Stalingrad was surrounded. More than 300,000 Axis troops were trapped. The correct military decision was clear: break out while escape was still possible. But Hitler's orders were absolute. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Goering promised that the Luftwaffe could supply them by air. It was a fantasy born of pride. The airfields froze, the planes burned, and the soldiers starved. Stalingrad, once a symbol of victory, had become a coffin, and the lid was closing. Even as disaster unfolded, Hitler refused to face reality. He believed the power of will could conquer physics, weather, and hunger. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he issued impossible orders: no retreat, no surrender, no compromise. The generals on the ground knew the truth. The army was dying. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army endured a nightmare. Frostbitten soldiers burned furniture for heat. Medical tents overflowed with the dying. Rations fell to a few ounces of bread per day. Entire divisions disappeared into the snow. Hitler saw their suffering as proof of loyalty. He called them heroes of the Reich. But heroism could not replace food, nor faith replace fuel. Every decision he made deepened the tragedy. The defeat at Stalingrad was not simply military. It was moral. A war born of arrogance now collapsed under the weight of its own pride, and for Germany, the road from the Volga would lead only backward. In December 1942, the Sixth Army depended entirely on the Luftwaffe. Goering had promised Hitler that his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day: food, ammunition, fuel. In reality, most days they managed less than 100. Snowstorms blinded pilots. Soviet anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, and each flight was a death sentence. Transport aircraft crashed in flames along the frozen steppe, their cargo scattered across the snow. The soldiers in Stalingrad waited in vain for relief. The airfields at Potomnik and Gumrak became graveyards of metal. Ground crews worked without sleep, loading planes that would never return. Soviet troops tightened the ring with artillery fire, turning every landing attempt into suicide. Inside the city, starvation became a strategy. Men boiled leather belts for food. Wounded soldiers begged to be shot. Entire battalions were reduced to a handful of freezing survivors. The Luftwaffe had once symbolized German power. Now it symbolized futility. The air bridge had collapsed, and with it, Hitler's last illusion of salvation. While Paulus and his men fought for survival, the German high command turned away. At Hitler's headquarters, maps were redrawn, plans discussed, and new offensives imagined, as if Stalingrad no longer existed. Messages from the pocket grew desperate. Ammunition nearly gone. No rations. Thousands wounded. The responses were silence or orders to hold firm. When Field Marshal Manstein launched his relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, the trapped soldiers heard distant artillery and believed rescue was near. But the relief force was too small, the Soviet defense too strong, and Hitler refused to let Paulus attempt a breakout. The Sixth Army was ordered to wait for salvation that would never arrive. Even when Manstein's troops were within 50 kilometers, Hitler's obsession with holding the city sealed their fate. Stalingrad must remain a fortress, he declared. An army that had conquered half of Europe now waited to die, not from defeat, but from abandonment. By January 1943, discipline disintegrated. Entire companies refused orders. Some officers shot themselves rather than surrender. Others simply walked into the snow. Radio operators transmitted desperate messages until their batteries died. The once proud Wehrmacht, symbol of precision and power, had become a collection of starving, freezing shadows. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast appeals across the front. German soldiers, you are surrounded. Lay down your arms, you will live. Many wept upon hearing their native language for the first time in weeks. Others screamed back into the wind, refusing to believe what they already knew. The war was lost. In cellars and ruins, men huddled around candles, whispering prayers, writing final letters to wives they would never see again. The psychological weight of Stalingrad crushed the last remnants of faith in victory. What had begun as a campaign of conquest ended as a slow descent into despair. On January 31st, Soviet troops reached Paulus's headquarters beneath a wrecked department store. Surrounded and exhausted, he ordered his men to cease fire. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal just hours earlier, expecting him to commit suicide. Instead, Paulus chose to surrender, becoming the first German field marshal to do so. The remaining pockets of resistance held out for 2 more days. Then, silence. When the Red Army entered the ruins, they found 90,000 prisoners, half dead, covered in rags, many too weak to stand. The battle that Hitler had called the key to victory ended in total catastrophe. As Soviet soldiers raised their flags over the ruins, the scale of the defeat stunned the world. From the Volga to Berlin, the message was unmistakable. The German war machine could be broken. And from this ruin, a new momentum was born, one that would carry the Red Army all the way to Germany itself. The defeat at Stalingrad was not a mystery. It was the result of hubris. Hitler's refusal to listen, his obsession with symbols, and his contempt for strategy had doomed an entire army. The Sixth Army's destruction was not caused by Soviet brilliance alone, but by the blindness of German command. Blitzkrieg, the doctrine of speed and flexibility, died on the banks of the Volga. In its place came paralysis, fueled by ideology and pride. The generals who once led lightning victories now watched their soldiers freeze and starve because they were forbidden to think, to adapt, to retreat. For Germany, Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a reckoning, proof that no empire built on arrogance can survive the weight of its own delusion. The snow buried not only men, but an illusion that the Reich could ever be invincible. Before Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht carried an aura of unstoppable power. From Poland to France, from the Balkans to the gates of Moscow, German armies had swept across continents with terrifying speed. Soldiers believed in their superiority. Civilians believed in Hitler's genius. Even foreign observers considered German defeat almost impossible. Stalingrad shattered that illusion. As the news spread across Europe, families lit candles in windows, fearing the unspoken truth. Their sons were never coming home. German newspapers printed empty reassurances. Goebbels launched a desperate propaganda campaign, insisting that the defeat was merely heroic sacrifice. But letters from survivors, smuggled through Soviet lines, told a different story: starvation, frostbite, betrayal, abandonment. In German cities, quiet panic replaced confidence. Crowds gathered outside train stations looking for returning soldiers who would never arrive. Factories worked overtime to replace destroyed divisions. But no amount of steel could replace the loss of belief. For the first time, Germany faced a new and terrifying reality. The Reich could be defeated. The myth was broken, not by strategy, but by the cost of blind ambition. Stalingrad's consequences spread far beyond the Volga. The defeat weakened Germany's southern front so severely that Hitler was forced to abandon vast territories across the Caucasus oil fields that he believed were essential to winning the war, slipped out of reach. Entire armies retreated across frozen steppes, pursued relentlessly by Soviet tanks and infantry Allied leaders in London, and Washington saw Stalingrad as the proof they had been waiting for. It convinced them the Soviet Union would not collapse, and that Germany could be beaten through combined pressure on all fronts. Plans accelerated for new offensives in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France. Lend-Lease shipments doubled. Convoys braved U-boat attacks to deliver food, steel, and aircraft to the Red Army. Inside Germany, political tensions surged. Generals clashed with Hitler. Some began whispering about coups or assassinations. Ideas unthinkable just months earlier. Stalingrad created fractures not only on the battlefield, but inside the regime itself. The battle had ended, but the fallout had only begun. The psychological impact of Stalingrad struck deeper than any bomb. As the magnitude of the losses became known, 500,000 German and Axis troops, despair spread through the civilian population. Mothers stopped trusting official telegrams. Workers grumbled in factories. Even Nazi loyalists felt a creeping dread. Goebbels responded with total war, demanding absolute sacrifice from civilians. Cinemas closed. Luxury goods vanished. Rations tightened. Yet even this desperate mobilization could not hide the truth. Germany had lost its most experienced soldiers and officers. The Eastern Front, once a symbol of conquest, had become a graveyard. Meanwhile, surviving veterans returning from Russia whispered stories that contradicted propaganda. Starvation, cannibalism, frozen corpses stacked like walls, officers lost in madness. These stories spread quickly, sowing fear and disillusionment. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was a moral defeat. The moment when ordinary Germans began to realize the cost of Hitler's ambitions. The invincible Reich no longer seemed eternal. Its foundation had cracked. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad ignited a fire that would not be extinguished. Factories in the Urals and Siberia increased production at unprecedented rates. Tens of thousands of new T-34 tanks rolled onto assembly lines. Young men enlisted in droves, inspired by the victory on the Volga. Commanders who had earned their reputations at Stalingrad, Chuikov, Rokossovsky, Vatutin, became the architects of a new Soviet strategy. Deep operations, massive encirclements, and relentless pressure across the entire front. The Red Army, once on the brink of collapse, now drove the Germans backward, mile by mile. Every Soviet soldier carried Stalingrad within him, its ruins, its suffering, its triumph. The victory infused the entire nation with a sense of destiny. The war was no longer a struggle for survival alone. It had become a march toward justice, revenge, and liberation. From the Volga to Berlin, the road was long, but Stalingrad marked the first step toward the final victory. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the destiny of nations. It exposed the fatal flaws in Hitler's leadership: arrogance, rigidity, obsession with symbolic targets, and disregard for human life. It proved that modern war could not be won by ideology alone, only by strategy, logistics, and endurance. The ruins of the city became a monument to suffering and resilience. Soldiers who fought there carried scars, physical and invisible, for the rest of their lives. Families mourned, generations lost. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The Volga became a river of memory. But Stalingrad also offered a lesson written in fire and snow. No empire built on conquest can escape the price of hubris. Germany lost not just a battle, but the war's initiative. The road to Berlin began here, in the ashes of a city that refused to die. And history would forever remember Stalingrad not as a tragedy alone, but as the moment when the world changed direction.